Hi, welcome to Tag Arcade. And in today's tutorial, we are going to be resuming our Space Invader clone. So in the last tutorial, we talked about classes, and surprisingly, that is actually enough to start creating our own game. So if this tutorial helps you out, go to my website, www.tagarcade.com, and click on this nice button on the top right-hand corner. So let's go ahead and go into Unity, into our tutorial, and let's resume. So the first thing we want to do is we want to be able to shoot the bullet up onto the screen. So we want to be able to shoot to destroy the enemies. So let's go ahead and wait a little bit longer for Unity to open up, and let's go ahead and make our bullets. So let's go ahead and create a new cube, and we're just simply going to call this bullet. And now we're going to create a new game object, or not a new game object, a new script, and we're just going to call this bullet as well. And now we're just going to attach that bullet script to our bullet. So let's go to our inspector, let's go to bullet, make sure we have that script. The second thing is to make this a little bit more Space Invader-y, we want to move our player sphere a little bit closer toward the bottom of the screen. So let's move it to the bottom. And let's move the bullets sort of to the bottom of the screen too. So let's go, yeah, it's about right. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to our bullet script and code the bullet just moving up onto the screen. So what we're going to do is go to our bullet script, and we're going to say public void, no, not void, public float speed, so that we could dictate how fast we want the bullet to move. So we're going to say this dot transform dot translate and let's see, which way do we want to translate? So we know left and right is our x-axis and forward is our z-axis. So we want to change our z-axis. So for our x-axis, we want 0. For our y-axis, we're going to 0 because we're not going to change our height. But on our z-axis, we want it to go forward. So we want to go forward based on the speed. But we're also going to multiply it by time.delta time. So the reason why we're multiplying it by time.delta time is because we want to do an animation based on time, not based on frame. So if you were to delete time.delta time and just left it as speed, then what you're going to do is what is called frame-based animation. So the problem with frame-based animation is if the player who is running your game has a really fast computer, it could probably pump up maybe 90 frames per second or higher than 60 frames per second. If that's the case, your game is going to run faster on those computers than if your player has a slower computer, maybe pumping out at, say, 15 frames per second or 30 frames per second. So you don't want your animation based on frames. You want your animation to be based on time. So that's why I multiply our speed by time.delta time. So let's go ahead and file save and hit play. And what should happen is our bullet should fly forward. And our bullet is just standing still, not doing anything. So why is that? Well, if I go to our bullets, we see our speed is, say, 0. So let's try 10. 10's a little too slow, so let's try 20. Okay, 20 is okay. And when I hit stop play, you'll notice that if I look at my bullets, my bullet is back at 0. So when you hit play, what you are doing is you're going to sort of experimental mode. And in our case, we were experimenting what should our bullet speed be. Maybe our bullet speed should be 30. We're just experimenting with these variables. Once we're done experimenting, everything goes back to the defaults. So make sure that you're not hitting play and going into prototype experimental mode, and that you're stop and you're back into edit mode. So now that we experimented to see what our speed bullet should be and what we like, I think I like 20 personally, so I'm going to put it 20. In your game, go ahead and feel free to put it whatever speed you want it to be. And when you hit play, there goes our bullet flying off onto the wild blue yonder. Okay, so it's also really weird that our bullet is on the screen when you first start the game. So let's go ahead and hide our bullet. Do you also, no, okay, so that's not hiding the bullet, that's stopping our script from running. Mesh renderer is hiding our bullet. But before we hide the bullet, we got to take care of another thing, is we don't want our bullet to fly forward until the player fires the bullet. So we need to be able to say, hey, if you're not fired, don't move. So we're going to create another variable called public bool is fired. So when we start the game, we're going to say is fired equals false, and only if the bullet is fired do we move it upwards. Okay, gonna hit file save. We're gonna hit play, and now our bullet shouldn't be moving at all. It should just be staying there. And now, like I said, we want to hide the mesh renderer so that we don't actually see the bullet at the very beginning. So what's going to happen is when the player hits the spacebar key, we first have to put the bullet to where the player is. Once we put the bullet where the player is, we got to show the bullet so that the player can see that I'm shooting a bullet. Next, we have to make that variable is fired to true. So let's go ahead and do all that. So the thing that's controlling the player action is the player controller script. So we have to go to our player controller. So we're going to say if input dot get key down is key code. So what exactly is key code? Well, key code is essentially all the buttons you can press on the computer. So we're going to say key code dot space. So we only want this to happen when the spacebar key is pressed. So if the spacebar key is pressed, we want to have our bullet dot position equals to this dot transform dot position. Now the problem is we actually never referenced a bullet, so we first have to make the player controller know where our bullet is. So we're going to say public transform bullet. Okay, and now let's change that back to bullet dot position equals this dot transform dot position. So when you hit file save and go back into our Unity editor, let's go to our player sphere, and let's just rename that because sphere is not really that helpful. We're just going to call this player or player sphere. So now we have a reference to our bullet. So let's drag and drop our bullet to here, to our bullet. The reason why we're doing that is because sometimes our bullet may not be called bullet. Maybe our bullet's called laser, or maybe use a different asset. And you just have to tell our script, our player sphere, what our bullet is. So in our case, I just renamed it to laser, so our bullet is a laser. The good thing is, if you rename something, it automatically renames it over here as well. So we did our first part. We put our bullet to where our player is. Now we have to tell it to turn on the mesh renderer. So we're going to say mesh renderer, and we're just going to call this variable bullet renderer equals bullet dot get component mesh renderer open and close parentheses. And now we got to turn that bullet renderer on. So we're going to simply say bullet renderer dot enabled equals true. So we did the first two parts. Now the third part is getting into our bullet script and changing is fired to true. So what we're going to do is we're going to say bullet because that's the name of our script. We have to give it a variable name, so we're going to call this bullet script equals, and now I'm just simply going to copy, oops, that is not copy, that was paste. Let's copy this, let's paste it here, And now let's change this to our bullets. So we need to get our bullet script component of our bullet game object. So now we're going to say bullet script dot is fired equals true. Okay? File save. So now if we hit play and we move our game object or our player and we hit the spacebar key, our player is going to fire bullets. Great. So that's the first part of it. So the second part is we need to detect whether that bullet hits an enemy object, and if it hits an enemy object, to destroy it. So one way of doing it is the bullet can try to detect which of these 30 enemy game objects we collided with, and once we detect that, we're going to destroy that enemy object. Now, the problem with that is, in our case, we have 30. Sometimes we could have 50, sometimes we could have a whole lot more. So it's hard for a bullet to keep track of all those enemies and determine which one to destroy. So it's actually easier to do it the other way. We're going to have each enemy object detect whether it comes into contact with a bullet, and if it is, it's going to destroy itself. So we're going to say create a new script, and we're just going to call this destroy enemy. And we have to make sure that this script is attached to all of our enemy game objects. So we're just going to drag it to all our 3 enemy types. And let's double check. Enemy, we have the destroy enemy script. Enemy 2, destroy enemy. Enemy 3, destroy enemy. So in order to use the built-in Unity3D's physics engine and to detect whether or not our bullet is colliding with our enemy game object, we have to use a function called onCollisionEnter. So unfortunately, I haven't memorized what that script should be, but I could look it up by going to help and going into scripting references. And in the search, I am going to say onCollisionEnter. And great, it tells me how to code it. Collider.onCollisionEnter. So I'm going to scroll down to the part where it says void onCollisionEnter collision. And we're going to go ahead and back into our Unity editor and back into our destroy enemy script, and we're going to modify that. So we're going to paste in void onCollisionEnter collision. Okay. Next, we wanted to know that if our enemy is colliding with a bullet, to destroy itself. Now we have to tag that bullet as a bullet. The reason being is if the player collides with the enemy object, we want the player to be destroyed instead of the enemy object. So what we're going to do is say go to bullet and go to our tags, and we're going to say add a tag. And in our tag, we're going to say bullet. And now when we look at our bullet, we got to make sure we tag this as bullet. Okay? So first we had to add the tag, and then once we do it, we have to make sure that our game object is tagged correctly as bullet. So now we're going to say if collision dot game object. So if the game object that we're colliding with has a tag equal to bullet, we are going to destroy ourselves, this .game object. So we're going to hit file save. We're going to hit play. And what's going to happen is we hit shoot. Nothing is happening. So why didn't our Unity3D engine get triggered? Sorry, let me try to rephrase that again. So why didn't Unity3D detect the collision happening? Well, if you look into our script, or if you look into the Unity engine, you actually need another component. You need what is called a rigid body. So a rigid body will detect whether or not one object is colliding with another object. So what we're going to do is make sure our enemy objects has a component called rigid body. So by default, you have nothing in the search engine. So you're going to do RI, and rigid body is going to come right up. So we're going to add a rigid body to all our 3 game objects. Rigid body, add component, rigid body. So now we're going to hit play, and all of our enemies are floating off or floating downwards. So why did that happen? Well, each of our game object, our enemy game object, has a rigid body, and what rigid body is, it lets you to add physics to your game object. And one component is to use gravity. So just like in the real world, when gravity is being used, everything gets pushed down to the floor. Well, in our case, we have no floor, so everything is just simply being pushed downwards. So let's go ahead and turn off our gravity for all of our enemy objects. And we're going to hit play. And now all of our enemies should stay put. And now if we shoot, we destroy an enemy. So why are these ones not being destroyed? Okay. Well, we know that we need a rigid body in order to detect a collision. So for the heck of it, let's go ahead and add a rigid body to our bullet as well. Make sure we don't have gravity, because we don't want our bullet to fly downwards. We want it to fly forwards. So we're going to hit play. And hit shoot. There we go. So let's destroy more stuff. So actually, if you look in here, as it hits a game object, you notice it's not flying forward. It's actually shooting downwards. So we don't want it to go downwards on the y-axis. We just want it to fly forward. So what we can do is, on the rigid body of the bullet, we're going to look at constraints. So we want to constrain the y-axis, which means it could only go left and right so that it could start where the player is, and it could go forward on the z-axis because a bullet should fly forward, but we don't want it to go up and down on the y-axis. So we want to restrict our bullet from going up and down on the y-axis. And because our bullet is not rotating in any way, shape, or form, we're going to freeze those rotations as well. So now when we hit play and shoot, it's going to destroy all of our enemies. So yeah, that is our first part. So that's our first part of updating our Space Invader clone. So if you like this tutorial, like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And until next time, have fun and keep on creating games.